Okay, so you know how sometimes you just feel like there are too many options?
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of paralyzing.
Oh, yeah.
Well, that's exactly what we're diving into today. It's all about the paradox of choice. And we're using Barry Schwartz's book, The Paradox of Choice, as our guide.
That's a good one.
It really is.
Mm.
It makes you think twice about whether more is always better.
Right.
Like just the other day, I was at the grocery store,
Mm-hmm.
just trying to buy yogurt. And I swear there were like 12 different kinds of vanilla.
Oh, gosh.
I was standing there for ages, just totally overwhelmed.
Yeah, I haven't been there.
Like, by the time I finally picked one, I was ready to give up on being an adult.
Uh,
But it's not just yogurt, you know? It's like this choice overload is everywhere these days.
it really is.
And that's what's so interesting about Schwartz's book. He really digs into why that might not be such a good thing.
Yeah, he challenges this idea that we have in Western societies, that more freedom, more choice, automatically equals more happiness.
Right? Like we're always told, the more choices you have, the better.
Yeah.
You can have it all.
Exactly. But he makes a pretty compelling argument that it's just not true.
Yeah. So let's talk about that. I mean, how much has the amount of choice we have really changed?
Oh, a lot, actually. Even in the last few decades, it's been pretty dramatic.
Okay, so give me an example.
Okay, so Schwartz talks about something as simple as college courses,
Uh-huh.
and he uses Swarthmore College as an example. They had over 120 general education courses
Wow.
for only 1,350 students.
And how many did they need to take?
9.
9 out of 120.
Yep.
That's crazy.
It is, compared to what previous generations had to choose from. It's a massive difference.
I can't even imagine having to pick 9 courses out of 120.
Right.
I'd probably just end up taking the history of cereal, just to avoid making a real decision.
Uh-huh.
Okay, but so we have more choices now. Why is that a problem?
Well, for one thing, all these options actually make it harder to decide.
Really?
Think about it. Things like choosing a healthcare plan or figuring out your retirement savings.
Yeah, no, those are definitely not fun.
Right. They're complicated.
Very.
And having so many options can just feel overwhelming.
Yeah, totally. It's like you're so worried about making the right decision that it becomes this huge burden, constantly second-guessing yourself.
Exactly.
Like, what if I miss something better?
Yeah, and it's not just about the complexity of the choices themselves. Schwartz highlights research that shows we're actually pretty bad at predicting our own future preferences.
Oh, really?
Yeah, there's this study he talks about with college students picking snacks.
Snacks?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the ones who chose snacks for several weeks in advance ended up being less satisfied than those who just picked week by week.
Interesting. So we're not as good at knowing what we'll want in the future as we think we are.
Apparently not.
Wow.
So even if we agonize over a decision for hours, we could still end up regretting it later.
That's kind of terrifying.
It is a little bit.
So even if we try our best to make the best choice,
Yeah.
we can still get it wrong.
Sometimes
I'm starting to see how this paradox of choice thing works.
it's definitely counterintuitive.
Okay, so then there's this whole idea of opportunity cost.
Right.
Which is basically the value of all the options you didn't choose.
Exactly.
Okay, I think I've heard of that. But remind me how that plays into all of this.
So Schwartz explains that opportunity cost can actually make us less satisfied with the choice we did make,
Even if it's a good choice.
even if it's a good choice.
Okay, how does that work?
Well, he gives this example of a study where people were asked how much they'd pay for a magazine subscription. The people who saw it next to other magazines were willing to pay less for it than those who just saw it by itself.
So basically just knowing we have other options makes us value what we choose less.
Exactly.
That's kind of a mind bender.
It is. And to really drive this point home, Schwartz talks about this experiment with jam.
Oh yeah, the jam experiment.
Have you heard of it?
I have. It sounds like a classic.
It is. So they set up a tasting booth at a grocery store,
Mhm.
and sometimes they had 6 jams, sometimes they had 24.
Okay. And what happened?
Well, more people stopped at the booth with 24 jams,
Makes sense.
but way fewer people actually bought any jam.
Really?
Yeah, they were overwhelmed by all the choices.
Wow.
And get this, the people who did buy a jar from the bigger selection, they said they were less satisfied with their choice.
So more choices led to less action and less satisfaction.
Yep.
It's like our brains just short circuit
Yep.
when we have too much to choose from.
That's a great way to put it. And Schwartz argues that this happens for a few different reasons. One of them is something called hedonic adaptation. Basically, it means that we get used to things over time, both good and bad.
So like that new phone feeling.
Exactly. You're super excited at first, but then that excitement fades pretty quickly as you adapt to having it. And the same thing happens with negative experiences. The intensity fades over time.
So even if you win the lottery,
Yeah.
you won't be walking on sunshine forever.
Not necessarily. Schwartz talks about this study where they compared lottery winners to people who'd become paralyzed in accidents.
Wow.
Pretty heavy comparison. But what's interesting is both groups basically return to their baseline levels of happiness relatively quickly.
So even extreme good fortune or bad fortune, it doesn't really affect our long-term happiness as much as we think it will.
That seems to be the case.
That's pretty wild.
It is.
It makes you wonder, what's the point of striving for all this stuff if we just get used to it anyway?
That's a great question. And it leads to what I think is one of the most unsettling parts of the book, this idea that all this choice might actually be contributing to an epidemic of unhappiness.
Well, hold on. An epidemic of unhappiness? But we live in a time of incredible wealth and opportunity. How could choice be making us unhappier?
It's a combination of factors. We have these really high expectations. We're told we can have it all, be anything we want.
Right.
But at the same time, we're faced with so many options that it's pretty much guaranteed we'll make choices we regret later. And when that happens, we tend to blame ourselves.
Oh, totally. This constant pressure to optimize every single decision.
Right.
Like from what you eat for breakfast
Yeah.
to what career you choose. And then when things don't work out perfectly, which, let's be real, they rarely do, we beat ourselves up for not making the best choice.
Exactly. And Schwartz points out that this self-blame can really take a toll on our mental health.
Makes sense.
He talks about the work of psychologist Martin Seligman, who studied learned helplessness.
Learned helplessness.
Yeah.
So, yeah, remind me what that is again.
Sure. It's basically this idea that if people experience negative outcomes over and over again, even when they have control over the situation, they eventually just give up.
Oh, wow.
They learn to be helpless, and a big part of that is how we explain those failures.
Okay.
If we tell ourselves things like, I'm just bad at making decisions, or I'll always screw things up, we're much more likely to fall into that trap of learned helplessness.
So in a world with endless choices, where we're constantly bombarded with messages about achieving our full potential, it's easy to see how we could start to feel helpless when things don't go our way.
Exactly. The very freedom of choice that we celebrate can become a source of anxiety and unhappiness.
That's kind of a depressing thought.
It is a bit. But Schwartz doesn't just leave us hanging there. He offers some insights into how we can navigate this paradox and make choices that lead to greater satisfaction.
Okay, I'm all ears.
One of the key concepts he introduces is the difference between maximizers and satisficers.
Maximizers and satisficers. Okay, I'm intrigued.
So maximizers are the people who are always striving for the absolute best outcome.
Okay.
They need to explore every single option, weigh every pro and con, make sure they aren't missing anything.
I know a few people like that.
Right.
They're the ones who take forever to order at restaurants.
Yes.
And then they spend the rest of the meal wondering if they should have gotten something else.
Exactly. They get so caught up in finding the best that they miss out on actually enjoying the moment.
Right.
Satisficers, on the other hand, have a different approach.
Yeah. What do?
They set a standard for what's good enough, and then they choose the first option that meets that standard.
So they're not worried about finding the absolute best.
Nope. They're happy with good enough.
That does sound less stressful.
It is.
But doesn't that lead to settling?
It's a good question.
I mean, don't we need a little bit of that maximizer drive
Yeah.
to push us towards excellence?
You do have a point there. It's definitely a balance. And Schwartz isn't saying that we should all just become passive satisficers and give up on striving for anything great.
Okay.
But his research does suggest that overall satisficers tend to be happier.
Really?
Yeah. They experience less regret, make decisions more easily, and are generally more content with their lives.
So how do we shift away from that maximizer mindset
Mm.
and embrace the art of good enough?
Well, Schwartz suggests a few strategies. One is to set realistic expectations. Instead of aiming for perfection, which is often unattainable, focus on finding options that meet your basic needs and preferences.
So good enough doesn't mean settling for mediocrity.
Not at all. It just means recognizing that the pursuit of perfection can often be more stressful than it is satisfying.
Okay, I can see that.
Like if you're looking for a new apartment, You could spend weeks researching every single listing in your budget.
Right.
Or you could define your must-haves, like location size, whatever matters most to you, and then choose the first place that checks those boxes.
Yeah, that makes a lot more sense. And then once you've made a choice,
Yeah,
try not to dwell on the what-ifs.
exactly. Focus on the positive aspects of your decision and let go of any lingering doubts.
Okay, so another strategy is to set limits on the number of options you consider.
Exactly.
Like give yourself a choice budget.
I like that. It's about consciously creating those constraints to prevent yourself from getting overwhelmed.
That's a good idea.
And speaking of constraints, Schwartz actually argues that embracing certain constraints can be a really powerful way to boost our well-being.
Wait, hold on. Embrace constraints. But isn't the whole point of choice to break free from constraints and maximize our freedom?
That's what we're often led to believe. But Schwartz suggests that, paradoxically, embracing certain constraints can actually enhance our freedom and happiness.
Okay, now I'm really curious.
So think about it. Rules, commitments, traditions. These are all forms of constraints.
Right.
But they can also simplify our lives and free up mental energy.
I guess that's true.
They provide structure and guidance, which takes some of the pressure off of us to constantly be making choices.
So instead of seeing constraints as limitations, we should view them as helpful guidelines.
Exactly. They can actually free us up to focus on what truly matters.
I like that.
And there's another interesting aspect to this. Schwartz argues that our obsession with individual choice might actually be harming our sense of community and shared purpose.
Okay, how so?
Well, when we prioritize individual choice above all else, we can lose sight of the importance of collective values, social responsibility at the common good. We become a collection of individuals, each pursuing our own narrow self-interest.
I see.
He uses the Amish community as an example of how voluntary constraints, while they might seem restrictive to outsiders, actually foster a strong sense of belonging and purpose.
Interesting.
Their shared values and traditions create a social fabric that supports their well-being.
It's like by focusing so much on our own individual choices, we're missing out on the deeper satisfaction. That comes from being part of something larger than ourselves.
That's a great way to put it, and it raises some important questions about how we can find a balance between individual choice and collective well-being in a world that seems obsessed with maximizing options.
So basically what we're saying is more choices don't always mean more happiness.
Right.
It's kind of like the opposite sometimes.
Yeah.
More choices lead to more stress and more indecision.
And more regret.
Like we always feel like we could have done better.
That's the paradox of choice in a nutshell.
We want freedom and autonomy.
But too much choice can actually backfire.
And make us miserable.
Exactly.
It's like we're drowning in options and we've lost sight of what actually matters. You know, this whole conversation has really made me think.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I definitely fall into that maximizer trap.
I think a lot of us do.
Like always trying to find the best of everything
It's hard not to.
and then feeling disappointed when I inevitably don't.
It's a common struggle.
But it's good to know that once we understand this stuff, we can start making choices that actually lead to more happiness.
Right.
Like we can set realistic expectations
And embrace constraints.
and focus on finding good enough solutions instead of always chasing after perfection.
Exactly.
It's about simplifying, prioritizing, and focusing on what truly brings us joy.
In meaning.
It really makes you think. Think back to a time when you were overwhelmed by choices. Were you a maximizer in that moment? Or were you a satisficer? How did that affect your experience?
It's a good question to ask yourself.
It is. And I think Schwartz's book gives us some really helpful tools for navigating this whole choice thing.
I agree.
But it also raises another question. Could our obsession with individual choice be hurting our sense of community and shared purpose?
That's a really interesting thought.
It is, isn't it? Maybe by constantly focusing on maximizing our own individual happiness, we're actually missing out on something bigger, something more meaningful.
Something to think about, for sure.
Well, folks, that's about it for our deep dive into the paradox of choice.
It's been a good one.
It really has. It's a book that challenges how we think about making choices.
And how those choices shape our lives.
If you're interested in learning more, I highly recommend checking out Schwartz's book.
It's worth a read.
Until next time, happy choosing.